I'm John Buchanan. Now, whenever we think about programming music, we think about notes. We need notes to make music, of course we do. But as we know, of course, effects treatments can bring so much to the patterns and the parts that we program. And what we're going to do within this video is to see how distortion can be used as a musical element. Now remember, distortion comes in lots of different shapes and sizes, but what distortion effects have in common is that they add harmonic content to sounds. Now how they do that might vary. Sometimes we take sounds and we pass them through emulated tube circuits. Sometimes we take sounds and we push them through tape saturation. Those kinds of treatments that effectively just take the sounds and push them to the edge where they feel like they're going to break. And with that comes a little bit of danger and a little bit of excitement. And that tends to bring a lot of sounds to life in interesting ways. Now, in the early days of digital, when computers sort of took over from tape machines, whilst there was a lot of kind of practical, hooray, we can do all kinds of things that we couldn't do with tape, there was also just a slight sense that digital recordings sounded a bit cold by comparison with their kind of tape-based predecessors. And to an extent, that's fair. But what we can do, of course, with digital effects, particularly with distortion-based effects or anything that kind of emulates the behavior of tube channels or preamps in some way, is to bring those qualities back to our digital recordings. And what we're going to do here is to look at 4 ways or 4 separate processes, all of which can bring distortion. There are many more than that within Logic, by the way. We're just going to look at 4 and we're going to see what impact that has on a piece of music. Now, to start with, I'm just going to focus on 3 musical parts that are happening, these 3 at the top of this track, which together sound like this. Okay, so we're going to start with this little punchy electro part, which is a retro synth sound, which is happening up here all by itself. And by itself, it sounds like this. It's kind of providing the bass foundation for this track. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of Chromaglow to this sound. Now, as we know, because we've looked at Chromaglow, in fact, I'm going to put all the distortion effects in one line. So the reason why I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap here is because I want to be able later to be able to punch them all in and out at once. So I'm going to put them all next to each other. So we're in a position to just bypass them all together when we've got all of the effect in that we want. Now, Chromaglow, as we know, allows us to add saturation in a number of different ways. So I'm not going to go too much into depth here. If you haven't seen Chromaglow before, go and watch the video about Chromaglow. But what I want to do quite quickly is to find a solution for this sound that feels like it might be quite interesting. And I think I am probably heading for magnetic, which is the tape emulation. Now, the further I push drive, the more we're going to hear this effect happen. And what could be better than 100%? Well, actually, that's a really great question. What could be better than 100%? Well, the only problem with an effect which is driven this hard is that it becomes really predictable really quickly. And it's really easy to apply distortion to a sound like this and to forget that, of course, there are many other tracks that are going to be playing within this part as well. What I'm interested in trying to do across this video is to create a kind of subtle distortion treatment for each of the sounds that I want to apply distortion to, and to see what effect that has in terms of warming up a number of sounds in more subtle ways. So the first thing I'm going to do is to back the drive amount down. So I don't only want less of this effect, I also want it to be moving in some way. So in other words, rather than just a fixed value, rather than just it sitting there at a particular point, what I want to do is to have this effect move in some way. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to come to one of the MIDI effects, And the one that I'm going to choose is Modulator. Now, again, this is a processor, a MIDI effect that we've looked at before. But just to remind you, what I have the potential to do here is to effectively use the LFO stage of this. And in fact, that's the one I want to use. I'm not interested in the envelope. I want the LFO to basically affect the amount of movement of this drive control. In other words, I want this drive control to be controlled by this LFO shape, which at the moment, as you can see, is producing this kind of sawtoothy shape, which is happening at the moment. Now, how am I going to do that? Well, the first thing I need to do is I need to link this movement to this parameter. And the way that that's done is I'm going to come to where it's being sent to, and I'm going to change it from the mod wheel, and I'm going to take it to learn plugin parameter. Now, the plugin parameter that you are going to select needs to be within the channel strip for this particular instrument. So I can't use Modulator to control something on another instrument. It would need its own modulator. But I can choose anything which exists within this list. So I've gone to learn parameter, and the moment I touch the drive control, what we'll see is that now drive is automatically assigned here, and we can see it going absolutely crazy over here as well. Now that's fine, but that's going to be far too much movement. I know you want to hear it though, don't you? Okay, well, fair enough. Actually, that's happening so fast, we can't really hear it right now. I think we'll hear it a little bit better if we slow the rate down. So I'm going to take the rate down to literally a couple of bars. And now we're going to hear the drive amount on this sound come and go much more undulatingly. Always making up words. And that's a whole lot more interesting. Now, again, it probably gets a little bit too big. It certainly also gets too small. So the first thing I'm going to do is to restrict the overall output level so that rather than the sound overall going from minimum to maximum, I'm going to have it go from minimum to about halfway. But what I'm then going to do is to produce the offset here so that it climbs to nearer 100%, let's say, but it never gets lower than about 50. And again, this is just trial and error. I'm going to just keep playing with these parameters until I've got a shape that feels like it's working well. I like that. What that's doing is it's giving us a lot of drive, a lot of push, and it feels like it's working well. Okay, there's our first sound. So I'm going to close these down and we'll move on to the second sound. Now this is the kind of high paddy, stringy thing which is coming from Sample Alchemy. It's got a bit of pitch bend, and by itself it sounds like this. Which is fine. You can hear the kind of intention of what this sound is trying to do, and yet it's not really quite doing it. It feels like we could make this a lot harder, a lot more biting, a lot more dangerous. Now to do that, what I'm going to do is to come to the effects that are after the ones that are already just sort of statically working on this sound, a little bit of auto filtering, a little bit of the Quantec room simulator reverb, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to one of Logic's pedal board effects. Now I'm going to find those in amps and pedals, and here what we've got a chance to do is to come to the stomp boxes, and there's a whole bunch of distortions here that I can choose from, and I'm interested in coming down to the TubeBurner, because why wouldn't you be? Okay, so what we've got here is effectively an opportunity to add tube style saturation to this sound, and I think this is going to push this in quite an interesting place. Now again, remember, the whole idea of this video isn't to reinvent the kind of harmonic wheel and to just add loads of content. I'm looking for treatments that are a little bit more subtle. Right out of the box, again, I think this is going to be a lot. Sure enough, I'm not even going to get to the highest note because I think that will just rip your ears apart. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back drive down so that we're getting much less of that, but at the same time, I still want to feel like we're just pushing into this slightly more saturated space. Now, of course, that is going to make that sound a whole lot louder. I've got an output control here, so if I need to trim this effect, I can. That's going to control its overall output level. Let's just hear those two sounds together without their distortions, and then I'll punch them in. Now, interestingly, this little pad sound has also got some reverb, some delay on it. I've set up an auxiliary bus here, which is being sent through to this stereo delay. I'm just going to turn that up a little bit more so we can hear those delays just a touch more. This, I think, is just... Oh, it's a stereo delay, so I've got a quarter note on the left and an eighth on the right. And that just should smudge that out a little bit, I think. I'm just going to turn that up. And overall, that sound is a bit loud, but that's okay. I can back its fader down here. So suddenly now that's just got a bit more edge. It's got a bit more life to it. I think that's going to be interesting. Okay, let's just solo the third sound. Now, this is a weird noise. By itself, it's going to be very easy to kind of get the downbeat of this part in the wrong place. This is effectively playing on the second, third, and fourth 16th notes of every single bar. So in other words, the first note is missing, it does that pattern, but when I play it by itself, that's not going to be where you hear the downbeat, I don't think. Okay, so what I want to do with this sound again is to add some sort of intensity to this. What I'm going to do is to come to another distortion unit within Logic's main distortion options, and this one is going to be clip distortion. So effectively what I'm going to do here is again just to configure some settings. I'm going to make it pretty harsh, pretty hard, but we've got a mix dial here, and what that's going to allow me to do once I've got a treatment that I'm really happy with, to back down the amount of it so that it becomes a more subtle effect. Firstly, let's just get those settings right. Now remember, I've got two separate controls here. The output gain is controlling the overall output level, still probably a little bit hot. I can turn that down a tiny bit more. Whereas what the mix dial is doing is to select the amount of this effect relative to the dry effect. So in other words, if I turn it down to 0, we've just got the original sound. If I turn it up to 100%, we've only got the distortion. Now again, across a relatively narrow range, I think some variation to this dial might be quite interesting. So I'm going to repeat my trick. What I'm going to do on this particular sound is to come back to Modulator. Again, using this as a MIDI effect. And again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach this plugin that I want to be using the mix dial as the parameter that I want to be automating. But again, this is going to be way too much. And also what I want is a slightly different approach to the way that this is going to be introduced. Rather than an undulating shape, what I want to do is to choose a random shape instead. So effectively, the amount of mix is going to vary in random chunks. And you can see the mix dial now jumping around wherever it wants to go, depending on the output of the modulator effect. And at the moment, that's happening every quarter note. Well, I actually think that's going to be a bit slow. What I'm going to do is to take that up to 1/8 notes. But I also think that this movement being as sort of jerky as it is right now isn't going to help us either. I'm going to just smooth that out a little bit so that those movements are just being managed in a slightly more musical way. And then I'm going to repeat my trick of making sure that the overall output level is much less. We were working with a mix dial statically a moment ago of about, I don't know, 12% maybe. So anything over that is going to feel pretty enormous. So I'm going to make sure that I'm turning the overall level down. So we're just focusing on relatively low mix levels. But what this is going to do is to basically introduce a varying amount of mix. And that, I think, is going to help this part. Okay, let's hear those with the other parts as well that are just in the track. Again, I'm going to start with all of these distortions off, and then we'll punch them in. That's working really nicely. What I've done is just to send this third part through to that main delay as well. There are actually now 2 delays operating on this sound. I'm going to send it through to here. And actually this gives me an idea, because whilst these parts are working really nicely, it might be interesting to rough up this delay treatment a little bit as well. Just again, to bring it something else that maybe we can get from distortion. Again, I'm going to come back. This may not work, but you know, it's always worth a try, isn't it? I'm going to come back to the stomp boxes. I'm going to come back to distortion, and I'm going to use the grip pedal. So this is a really simple little distortion unit, which I think is based on the raw distortion pedal. So effectively what we've got is an overall volume control. We've got a filter, which is going to filter out high frequency content, and we've got a distortion amount. So across these 3 parameters, we've got a chance to configure an amount of distortion here, and then a kind of treatment for how much we're going to filter out high frequency content. Okay, so this grit treatment is really totally reinventing this stereo delay, and it's way louder than I need it to be, but it's definitely edgier and it's got something about it which I think is a bit more driven now. Okay, let's just put that in with everything else within this track as well, and let's just see where we're headed. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of these sounds out, all of these distortion treatments, and we'll put them in the second time round. Well, that's one way to completely reinvent the sounds within your mix. Now, of course, it's an unfair comparison. Distortion is adding all of this harmonic content, and that in itself is bringing more volume. So really, the before and after needs to include a kind of volume compensation offset. But you can hear where these sounds were, and you can see where they've gone to. And yes, we can adjust volumes for sure, but it's not just volume that's changing. We're getting all of this additional drama and power and drive out of these sounds. So blending different distortions, and there are so many to choose from within Logic's own distortion folder, and particularly from within the stomp boxes. Remember, all of those have been taken from pedalboard, and if you use the pedalboard version, you could even stack up different distortions. What they do is to allow you to go somewhere else, and Chromaglow, of course, the most recently added kind of option in this particular area, takes us into saturation territory as well. And across all of those options, all of that extra harmonic wonder can really produce a lot of drive in tracks like this.